See, there's an old saying that Canadian will never lie to you, will tell you the truth. Now, if you're a fan of the Rolling Stones, if you've never heard about this before, I'm not going to lie to you. Let me talk to you. Say like Ellie Knight. You know, Keith Richards once went blind in Canada. Actually, twice. You're saying, well, I don't remember him going blind. Well, not blind in the literal sense. He was saved by a blind person in a heroin bust in Canada. Now, music journalist Nick Kent once said, called Keith Richards mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Now, Mick Jagger thought that Richards' image had contributed to him becoming a junkie. He had drug problems over the years. In 1994, Richards said his image was like a long shadow. Even though it was nearly 20 years ago, you cannot convince some people that I'm not a mad drug addict. Now, Richards' notoriety for illicit drug use stems in part from several drug busts during the late 60s and 70s and his candor about using heroin and other substances. Richard has been tried on drug-related charges 5 times, in 67, twice in 73, in 77, and in 78. The first trial, the only one culminating in a prison sentence, resulted from a February 67 police raid on Redlands, Richard's Sussex estate, where he and some friends, including Jagger, were spending the weekend. The subsequent arrest of Richards and Jagger put them on trial before the British courts, whilst also trying them in a court of public opinion. On June 29, 67, Jagger was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment for possession of 4 amphetamine tablets. Richards was found guilty of allowing cannabis to be smoked on his property and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Both Jagger and Richards were in prison at that point. Jagger was taken to the very tough Brixton prison in South London, and Richards to Wormwood Scrubs prison in West London. Both were released on bail the next day pending appeal. On July 1st that year, the Times ran an article entitled "Who Breaks a Butterfly Upon a Wheel?" portraying Jagger's sentence as persecution and public sentiment against the convictions increased. A month later, the appeals court overturned Richards' conviction for lack of evidence and gave Jagger a conditional discharge. Now, the Rolling Stones were hanging with Margaret Trudeau and doing all kind of crazy stuff in the mid-70s, and I think the Stones were in Canada quite often in that period. But get this, the most notorious was in February of 77. Now, Richards was staying in a Toronto hotel, then known as the Harbour Castle Hilton on Queens Quay East. When the RCMP, and you know how they nicely are in relation to drugs, found heroin in his room during a search and charged him with possession of heroin for the purpose of trafficking, an offense that at that time could result in prison sentences of 7 years to life under the Canadian Narcotic Control Act. His passport was confiscated, and Richard and his family remained in Toronto until the 1st of April, when Richards was allowed to enter the States on a medical visa for treatment of heroin addiction. The charge against him was later reduced to simple possession of heroin. Now, for the next 2 years, Richards lived under threat of criminal sanction. Throughout this period, he remained active with the Stones, recording their biggest-selling studio album, Some Girls, and touring North America. Richards was eventually tried in October 78 and pled guilty to possession of heroin. He was given a suspended sentence and put on probation for a year, with orders to continue treatment for heroin addiction and to perform a benefit concert on behalf of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, after a visually impaired fan testified on his behalf. Now, this made international headlines because no one knew about the Canadian National Institute of the Blind at an international level. And across Canada, it drew more attention to visually impaired programs for the blind and visually impaired. So it was a kind of half-win for Richards, full win for the CNIB, and the rest is history. Now, although the prosecution had filed an appeal of the sentence, they were looking at jail time for him. Richards performed 2 CNIB benefit concerts at the Oshawa Civic Auditorium on this 22nd of April, 79. Both shows featured the Stones and the New Barbarians. In September 75, the Ontario Court of Appeal upheld the original sentence. In 2016, Richards stated that he still occasionally drinks alcohol and consumes hash and cannabis. Neither here nor there. But he was saved by a blind fan of the Stones. So here you go. When Richards literally went blind, he was saved. And I think he's still alive today because a blind man basically said, you know, he's a talented guy. Please let him do something on our behalf. Because the person who basically spoke, he said, blind people, the visually and sighted people love the Stones, and we all do. So that's the story about when Keith Richards went blind. If you like what we're doing here, give us a like, comment, subscribe, or share. Bye.